Today I'm going to be taking a look at Proxmox Recovery, how to get your VMs up and running again after your host encounters a problem. I'm going to take a look at recovering VMs from backups, including Proxmox Backup Server and the VZ dump backups, and also if you just have the disk that had the VM files on it. So I'm going to be taking a look at trying to get them from ZFS storage, file storage, or LVM storage back into running VMs. To demonstrate this, I created a test Proxmox system with VMs and containers stored in many different ways. I have my VMs backed up via VZ dump backups and Proxmox PBS server, and I also have VMs stored on many different types of disks, including ZFS, LVM, and directory storage. And now I'm going to break that VM so it can't boot anymore, and then I'm going to try to recover all of the VMs on that system. So I just went in via IPMI and deleted a ton of stuff you shouldn't delete on that system. My Proxmox server won't boot anymore and just gives me a kernel panic upon boot. And I want to get all the data from this system. I have a separate boot drive in this system that doesn't have any VM files I care about. And that means I could overwrite that drive with a new copy of the operating system. If you have your Proxmox operating system installed on a drive that has VM data, reinstalling it will format the drive and remove that data. So you'll want to get a separate drive to install on or make a clone of your previous disk. Making a clone of all the disks with data is a good idea anyways, because if you make a mistake, you still have another copy of that data. I will need to reinstall Proxmox on the system to have a OS to run the VMs on. I can recreate most of the configuration from the setup or from the backup files, but the rest of the data I will have in the VM images, which I will be able to restore. The one thing to note when reinstalling it after recovery is to make sure you don't touch any data on the drives you don't want to lose. So I'd be extra careful and unplug any drives from the system that has data you don't want to be used, just so you can't accidentally install it on that drive when you're installing Proxmox. Now the Proxmox installer has finished and I have this blank Proxmox system right here. The boot drive has no data and almost no configuration on it, and I'm ready to restore the VMs from the other drives in the system. Depending on your setup, you might have to do some configuration first, as the configuration is not backed up by default. So you may need to do things like set up your network, users, permissions, and other things. But I have a relatively simple configuration set up here, so I just installed updates and I'm ready to go. A lot of what I'm doing requires the terminal, so I've SSH'd into the system's root account, and I'm going to start running some commands to try to get some of that data back and find out what the drives have. So the first command I like to run is lsblk, and this lists the different block devices on the system. So this SDA drive is my new boot device that I've just set up, so it doesn't have any VMs on it. And then SDB and SDC are where I've set up all of my VMs earlier that I want to restore. SDC has all this LVM data that it's automatically detected, so this has my LVM VMs that I'm going to restore. And then SDB has this big partition and a little partition. I set it up as ZFS, so if I want it to detect the ZFS drive, I can do zpool import. And it's going to see that Z pool that I have. Now I will run Z pool import and the name of the pool, and it will import the pool and mount it and make it so I can see all the data on it. It says I have to run -F to force it because this system's never seen that pool before. Now when I run ZFS list, I can see my ZFS data. So all of these story ones, these are all ZFS data that I've set up. I set up a few different ways of storing data to demonstrate how it can be restored. So I created a few data sets here. One of them is PBS, that I'm going to be using PBS to restore from. VM file is just a file store. This is the same as if you used ext4 or XFS or another file storage solution to store it. And then I have ZFS VM stored on here too. The first thing I'm going to restore is my VZ dump backups. And in order to do that, I'm going to remount my directory file that I mounted earlier on this new install. And it'll detect all the files that were previously there. So if I look at cd/story/VM file, what I'm going to notice is it's going to have all the Proxmox data. So dump, images, private, snippets, template. And then if I add this in Proxmox to a new data store, it will detect this data and it'll just show it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to data center, storage, add, directory. I'm going to say new story file, and I'm going to do /story/VM file. And it's going to start detecting the data once I set it up. I'm going to make sure to check all of these because I had many different types of data, and I'm going to click add. And in a second or two, it's going to show up here, shows a little bit of usage, and I can see all of the data on this. I can see my backups, I can see my VM disks, I can see my ISO images I put on here, my templates, and lots of different other data that I have on this system. Now, it's not perfectly correct. It's confused about some things, like these VM raw images are actually containers, not VMs. But I'm not going to look at these VM disks because I have backups, and backups are really easy to restore in Proxmox. And another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new data set in ZFS to store my restored data on, because I don't want to store the data that I've restored on the same ones that has existing data, because you can have some possible issues because it might be using VM numbers or something else. Now that I've created a spot to put my VMs on once I restore them, I'm going to click on a VM that I want to restore. I'm going to click restore. I can see like notes of it, like the name that I had it earlier. I can see like the date and time I made the most recent backup. I'm going to create this new directory that I just created, this empty spot to put it on. I can select the number, and by default, it'll just keep everything the same and restore it. And now my VM is finished restoring from backups. I can click start. It's going to run the VM, it has the same name, has all the same hardware configuration, and it's just ready to go. One issue you may run into is the VM won't be able to start because the CD drive has a CD that it isn't able to access anymore. And if this is just a boot CD, you won't need it anymore, so I'm just going to edit and say don't use any media, and now it won't be using that old CD virtual drive, so I can start the VM up right now. So if I take a look at this, this is a Fedora VM, and it's just going to start booting up, and I have a fully working Fedora system right here. And this is the simplest way to do restoring files in Proxmox. You just put them in a backup storage directory on a new system, you click restore, and it'll return it just to the configuration you had earlier. I'm also going to do this with a container just to show how a container can be done too. Going to set it up really easily and just click restore. And since containers have less information on them, that's super fast. It just finished right there. And my little container can start right now. And I just have a working little container running Debian Linux. Now I'm going to restore data from PBS. So PBS has its own way of storing data that's not really accessible to a normal user, just like a basic image file. So you're going to need to install Proxmox Backup Server to read those backups you have created. So now I'm in the control panel for PBS, and I need to get that data back again. I will need to add it as a data store. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it like PBS data, and I'm going to put that path in of the system. But unfortunately, I can't just do this right here, because it's going to say that I can't create it because the file exists. So I'm going to actually have to go into the config files in the system and edit those to add it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my Proxmox system, and I'm going to edit the file in /etc/proxmox-backup. And I'm going to run vim datastore.config. And this is where it keeps all the information about those data stores. So I'm going to edit some text here, add data store, colon the name I want, so like PBS store, and then I'm going to add a tab and then the path that it wants. So it's like store PBS is what I had the data in. So now if I refresh this, I see my PBS store data, and hey, those are all my VMs from it. I can see all these VMs here, and these are all my backups I can do. If I want, I could just download these backups and put them on another system right now, but if I want to be able to restore them on my Proxmox server, I'm going to go to Data Center, Storage, and add this Proxmox Backup Server repository, and it'll detect all the data that's already there. And now I've added the PBS data store, and it can see all these backups. So it's the same as the other backups. I can just click on Restore for these backups, select the storage that I want it to be restored onto. It has all the settings for the VM. I click Restore, it'll start copying files, and within a minute or two, it'll be ready to start that VM up again. Unfortunately though, you don't always have access to backups to restore the VM from. Sometimes the only thing you have is the VM disk that it's booted from. So this would be something like an IMG file, or a ZFS, something like the ZFS VDEVs that it uses, or an LVM. I'm going to be taking a look at all these different types and how you can get it going. The general process for all of these though is to take that virtual image file, create a new VM, and add that image file that is already being used. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So I'm in Proxmox right now. I'm going to say create a VM. And I want to emulate, let's say, I think I have a Windows 10 one. So I'm going to call it like Win 10 Restore. Unfortunately, this configuration isn't stored with the image, and it's stored on the Proxmox server. And if that data gets lost, you don't have access to it, unlike the backups. So you might have to do some trial and error to make sure you get everything right. One thing to make sure you get right is the UBFI versus legacy BIOS. I believe this was a legacy BIOS VM, but if it doesn't show up as a boot device at all, try changing that to the other one and see if that will work. Disks, I'm going to actually delete all of these right now because I'm going to be adding that later on. CPU and stuff, I'm going to be adding about what I thought I gave the VM. I'm not sure exactly what config this had, but I can tweak this later on once I get it booted. So now I have a Windows 10 Restore one, which doesn't have any drives to boot off of, and I'm going to have to get that drive from the system. So I need to look around and see where it actually is. And I'm going to first take a look at if you're using file storage. So I'm going to take a look at that new store file, which was the one that used to have all these VMs. And under VM disks, I have this VM 106, and that's the VM that had my Windows VM I want to restore. But it's 106 instead of 105, so I'm going to do a little tweaking to make sure it can actually get added to that VM. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the configuration file for that VM, and then I can edit it so it has kind of custom settings that you can't normally add in a web page. And all this configuration data is under /etc/pve/commute server. And if I run ls, I can see the names of all my different VMs and their config files. See, I'm trying to get this onto 105, so I'm going to edit this with a text editor, in this case Vim, and then I'm going to edit this here. And in order to get the data I want, I'm going to use SATA 1, right? SATA 0. So this would mean the first SATA drive connected to the system. If you don't know exactly what to do, you can read like the other configs to get an example. So for example, if I looked at this 103 config, I can see it's using virtio 1. The other thing you could do is you could create a new virtual disk and see like what type of name it uses. So I could also go create like a hard disk with SATA on it. I could say I want it to be this empty one. So now if I edit this 105 configuration, I will see that it's added that file right here. And now I'm going to add the same name of that storage repository here. And then I'm going to put a colon, the VM number that I want it to use it from. So in this case, that's 106, 106, and then slash the name of the full name here. So that VM106-disk-0.qcal2. And then I'm going to save my text file and go back to the GUI and see if it's shown up there. So I can see I now have a hard disk here. It's showing up as something. Let's just see what happens. It's going to try to start it, and it says it's okay. And if I open the console, it's having an issue here. And my issue here is because it's not set as the correct boot device. Because when I add this later, it doesn't adjust the boot device. So if you have that issue, you're going to have to go under the options, boot order, and then add that SATA device you just added. So then it can actually boot from that SATA drive. So now I'm going to do start, and hopefully it can boot from the SATA drive that I've added to it. And yeah, that looks like a Windows install. It's starting up right now. And now I can see my Windows 10 VM is booted to the desktop, and it's on the new storage. So I know it's all running there, and it's all set up correctly so that the whole system is going to be working fine after this restore. Now let's take a look at getting it from different types of storage. So I'm going to take a look at LVM now. And LVM is a little bit different than file because you can't just CD into a directory. It has the same idea of kind of like a file container, but it's a block device in Linux. It shows up instead of a file. So in order to do that, we're going to have to mount the storage and see if we can get it mounted. So I'm going to just do LVM and see if it will find the existing volume groups, and we're going to just show it that. And we're going to say, oh, old snoo, which is the name of my second one. So I'm going to add it, and then it's going to show up here. And I'm going to see if it shows up with the VM disks here. And yep, I see all these VM disks. They have all the data on it, and I can start another one with it. And let's actually start a container with it, because I haven't done much with containers here. One thing that's a bit annoying right now is 2 of these are containers and 3 of these are VMs. And they're all showing up as raw data, and nothing shows up under container volumes. So I'm going to have to kind of take a peek and try to figure out which ones are containers and which ones aren't. So if I run lsblk again, I can see all these devices, these ones here, and the amount of size. And this 8 gig one is definitely a container because you cannot normally make a VM that small, and that's the default for a container. But one of these also is a container. And I'm going to actually run some tools on it to see what type of data these containers have so I can try to make a good guess. So I'm going to run like part X. And this lists the partition on the drive or the file that I'm giving it. So I'm going to essentially give it the LVM file and ask what partitions it has on there. So now I've ran part X on all of these, and it shows something interesting. So on 3 of these, it shows these partitions that it has as like an EFI system partition and then a main data partition. And this is kind of the default for most operating systems, how they partition the drives. But these 2 said it can't read the partition table at all. And one of these is the one I already know is a container. So it looks like 110 and 111 are both containers. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of detective work to kind of find out which one of these are which. So now I'm going to have to create a new container, and then I'm going to map it to that data that I've already created. So I'm going to do like fixed 110, let's call it that. And I'm going to set up a basic password. It's going to set up a lot of data, but I'm going to replace a lot of that data later on. I'm going to pull up one of the templates I had in the past. All this data is going to get replaced, so I don't mind it, but I have to keep this here for now. So I'm going to do like CPU, memory, network, just kind of set up all the defaults for these because I just want a basic container for me to replace data in later. So it's going to create this one, and then I'm now going to have this little container right here that I'm going to want to recover data from. So this is the CT106 that I have. And under resources, this is that root disk that I want to replace. So now I'm going to edit the container config file. The container config file is a lot like the VM config file. It's in a slightly different spot. It's in /etc/pve/lxc. If I run ls, I can see the config file for both of the containers my system has right now. And I'm going to go edit that root disk for 106 that I've just created. So I'm going to do vim 106.conf, and then this rootfs, I'm going to go change that to the one that I knew was a rootfs earlier. So I'm going to actually go to the one right here. So it's old snoo is the old LVM one that had the data I wanted. So then I'm going to take this 110 disk and start copying. Now that I know that my old VM disk is this 110 disk on old snoo, I can add it here. And it's going to be about the same as the VM, where you have like the name of it, and then you have the full 110, and then /VM -110 -disk-0. And hopefully this will just boot right up once I edit it. So now if I go to fixed 110 on my new one, it says it has a different root disk. Let's see how it boots from the different root disk. So it actually couldn't find that name, and it was saying it as an LVM name wasn't valid. So I wanted to figure out how I could make a valid name. So what I did is I actually created a new container to find out how it names it. So I went on a root disk, and I can see this root disk here. And then if I look at the config file for this one, I see on the other one, if I go to vim 107, the new one I just created, the rootfs doesn't have like a 101 slash or something. It just has that name. So now I'm going to go edit my previous one with that new data. So I'm going to just remove this 110 slash, save the config file, and then hopefully it can boot from that drive again. So I'm going to hit start, and now I have my container running with the previous data from the old container copied to it. So this has all my old data, but it's a new container running it with a new configuration. Let's take another look at ZFS because it's a different way of storing data, and I just want to see how restoring onto ZFS works. So I'm going to add my ZFS one. So I got my ZFS mounted, and it's showing some data, but it seems to be weird. It's showing subvol on some of these. It shows 4 of these and 1 container, but I know I have 2 containers. I know this one with 8 gigs of storage is also a container. And a lot of restoring from ZFS is like restoring from LVM, because ZFS and Proxmox uses the zvol, which is essentially a virtual block device that ZFS creates, and it stores the VM in it. And if I want to see where those are, I can run lsblk again, and all these ZD devices are what I have. Another way to see this is /dev/zvol/store and a name, and then I can see under like VMs, and I can see all my different ones. So I believe I was using 102 as a previous Windows VM, so let's restore that one again. So I'm going to say like win10 restore 2, and I'm going to just create another simple VM without really any data so I can add my disk later on. Now with this VM I just created, I found the VM disk name. It's in my old ZFS one that I pulled it from. I created an empty VM to copy the data to, and now I'm going to go edit the config file for this VM and add that SATA device with the ZFS pool and the ZFS block device that it's named after. Well, it turns out I actually rescued the wrong VM, because this is an Ubuntu VM, not a Windows VM. That's one of the annoyances. I just know the number that I previously used, not the name. This method can get relatively complicated, and a lot of Linux knowledge of knowing where those files are, and a lot of just tweaking and playing with the config files. It can definitely be a challenge to restore this way, which is a great reason to make backups using PBS or those VZ dump backup files, because it's essentially a one-click restore versus hunting for files and editing config files. But it is nice that you can do this if you need to restore. And if you have an image of that VM, you can get it running from just that image and no other config data needed. Let me know if you've had to do any of these recovery methods before and how it worked for you. I actually had to do this on one of my personal servers because I made a mistake with the boot configuration and all I had was backups and a few disk files. Luckily, I had PBS backups for most of the VMs, but some of them I just had disk files and had to use this annoying method to try to hunt those files down, make a new VM and configuration. It's really worth it to make VMs because restoration is so much easier. Thanks for watching this little Proxmox video and subscribe for more Proxmox and other computery videos in the future.